Well, I have the pleasure of talking with our congressional delegate from the 6th District here in the great state of Washington, Emily Randall. How are you, Congresswoman?
I'm doing pretty well, Jeff. I'm happy to join you today and also, glad to be back to work for the American people here in our nation's capital.
Yeah, so late Wednesday night, you voted along with your fellow colleagues in the House, and the vote was to reopen the government. You voted no on this. We'll get to that in a second, but it's been 44 days, and it has been quite the impact across the whole country, the whole world, really, as we're trying to figure this whole thing out. The 6th District is so diverse with different economic pockets, with the base there in Bremerton, and we've got all the logging history across Jefferson and Mason. As you spent most of your time in DC, but some of the time here, or just hearing from the constituents, what was the overarching message you heard?
Yeah, I heard almost exclusively from neighbors about affordability, whether they were furloughed or working without pay as essential workers for Puget Sound Naval Shipyard or, any of the other federal workers. We've got 27,000 in the 6th congressional district. Folks were worried about how they were going to feed their families. Some people, veterans who have been through many a shutdown had money set aside, but, newer workers or families with a lot of, expenses, a lot of kids, parents to take care of, they were struggling. And our food banks really stepped up to make more hours available and to, raise more supplies to be able to deliver to these workers, but they were worried about affordability. But so too were the tens of thousands of Washingtonians who are seeing their healthcare prices spike. They've been getting their notices, going into open enrollment and seeing doubling, tripling of their healthcare premiums and are worried about how they're going to pay it. And if they decide they can't pay it, they're worried about how they're going to pay their prescription costs and surprise healthcare expenses. Like our families all across the country are struggling with the cost of living. They were promised by this president during his campaign that he would tackle the cost of living and affordability and make it easier on folks. And that has not been the reality in the 6th district or anywhere in our nation. And, um, I got into politics because I believe that everyone deserves access to healthcare when and where they need it. My federal worker dad had good insurance, but my sister relied on Medicaid to pay for everything she needed. And I just couldn't stand by when so many of our neighbors were going to be forced off their healthcare plans because of the decisions of this Republican Congress and this president.
When I saw videos of families standing at food banks across the country, and especially seeing families on like military bases and things like
Yeah.
that, it was really impactful because they're still doing the job. You would see online too, people would maybe post their pay stubs that they're
Yeah.
work air traffic controllers, for example, working well over 40, 60 hours a week, but the pay, it said zero. And while, you know, hopefully retroactively they'll get that reimbursements from the work they had done, it doesn't help during those 45 days when you have mortgage payments and car payments plus weekly groceries and things like that. I saw on your website, randall.house.gov, that you have plenty of resources there, and kind of a frequently asked questions section. But for a lot of folks, it's kind of a gray area when you are trying to figure out, well, what's open, what's not open. One of the things that I didn't really even think about until I read it on your page was small business loans and the help and support that is out there that was not available during this. I mean, that is another huge part of the 6th district.
Absolutely. We have so many small business owners who are seeing their costs rise too. But I'll also say that I heard from the most small business owners who also buy their healthcare on the exchange. small business owners who don't have employer-sponsored health coverage, who make too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but relied on the Affordable Care Act enhanced premium subsidies and the tax credits to be able to afford health coverage for themselves, for their families, kids, parents, spouses. I had a woman in my office week before last who owns a flower shop and is trying to grow her business, um, trying to buy a building so that she can increase her revenue and not be just making it. But not because of the shutdown. She didn't qualify for a loan to buy the building because they only use your gross receipts for a small business loan. And, she doesn't have a high margin business. She has the ability to back that loan, but, she didn't have the flexibility. But what she was most worried about was the fact that she couldn't figure out how she was going to pay the extra thousands of dollars a year for her health coverage under the increase that she was going to see, and how her fellow business owners in her community were going to be able to afford that increase too.
How are you going to be able to share those types of stories of these new business owners, these young families that need this support when there was in the Senate a promise of a potential vote for these extended subsidies, but then we heard pretty much right away from Speaker Johnson that that might not happen. What are you going to do to try to convince, well, I guess 218 of your fellow 217 of your fellow members to get in on supporting these opportunities because it's good across both sides of the aisle?
Absolutely. You know, I was really, I think, moved by the conversations in the Rules Committee on Tuesday night. Um, there was a big increase in coverage of Rules Committee, so I think some of our neighbors may have been following along too, in which, Chip Roy and other Republicans talked about the challenges facing our healthcare system in, a really raw way. I think all of my colleagues know or should know that their neighbors are facing challenges affording healthcare, accessing healthcare because rural hospitals are closing all across the country. And those that aren't closing, like in our district, are really, having to make tough decisions about departments staying open or closing, about staffing, about all sorts of things. And it is hard for everyone, no matter red or blue, your representative, to afford healthcare access. And, I mean, Chip Roy's speech in the Rules Committee sounded like a call for like single payer healthcare. It was so radical. So I do think there's space for us to have bipartisan conversations. I don't trust the Republicans to bring forth a plan on healthcare because they have been saying they would have a plan in 2 weeks for over a decade
Hmm.
and have not produced one. I don't believe that the first step should be to demolish our healthcare system and then try to rebuild it. I think we should keep people insured and keep people um, able to access healthcare while we work to fix it. That's why I led the Universal Healthcare Commission legislation at the state level. That's why I worked so hard on Washington's healthcare system before I came to Congress, because I believe it's our responsibility to make sure folks have access to healthcare even as we improve the system.
So the government is reopened, but it's not just like a light switch where all of a sudden everything is going to start working. I'm interested on your way back into town this week. You came in a little early, you mentioned before we started this. Did you see any of the impacts of the shutdown? I'm presuming through SeaTac when you flew out, or?
I was a little worried. That's part of the reason I left Tuesday morning instead of Tuesday afternoon or Wednesday morning to get here in time for votes. I didn't want to let a delay keep me from my constitutional duty. But I will say that the SeaTac was um, operating pretty seamlessly. The lines were longer,
Sure.
but I'm really impressed by the work that the Port of Seattle commissioners have been doing to try and, um, help support uh, TSA agents and airport staff during the shutdown, even as the White House directed um, airports to ratchet down their flights. I think SeaTac didn't just flip a switch to go to 10% deduction. They like slowly lowered. I had to walk down to security gate checkpoint one instead of five, which is kind of
Okay.
painful. But it went pretty fast for
And
me and my fellow travelers.
yeah, that's very good. And they're always, working there to try to increase the time it takes to go through. And,
Yeah.
it's a pretty good airport, great hub for the port and for the state. What are some of the things over your time that you've taken from when you were in the state senate to DC to shine the light on how you think some of our Washington policies
Mm.
could make for good DC policies?
Yeah. One of the things that I think about the most often is how bipartisan our Washington state was during my time in Olympia. 93, 95, 97. It changed every year. Percent of the bills that we passed had bipartisan support. And as a member of leadership in the Senate, we met every week with the Republican caucus leadership to talk about what was coming up before the floor, what policies we could get folks from our caucuses to work together on, how we might find a path forward. And I miss that. I miss that feeling that we were really aligned as a legislative body, not always in agreement on policy, obviously. There are some issues, of LGBTQ rights and abortion care access, that are going to be partisan, going to continue to be partisan. But um, on the meat and potatoes of the legislature, we were able to find a path to work together more often than not. And even in the capital budget negotiations, when the state had a 60 vote threshold to pass the capital budget, um, Democratic budget writers worked with Republican budget writers to make sure that we were aligned and had the votes. And I thought about that so much during the shutdown as we would see vote after vote after vote that couldn't hit that 60 vote threshold. And I thought, I mean, who was in the room when you decided that this was the path forward? Do you know how to count votes? Um, but so that like spirit of working together, I think, is important for our country. It's also important that we remember that the legislative branch is separate and independent from the executive branch. And I introduced an emergency powers, check and balance bill during Governor Inslee's term following COVID, because we had seen, him really overreach in his executive authority in Washington, be out of step with the rest of the country, in where we set our limits. And, in my time, we also sued the governor twice as the legislature because he had overstepped his veto authority. And to think about like that reality as compared with the reality in which members of the Republican House conference say in committee that it is their job to carry out the priorities of this president, and that President Trump says he's got two jobs, the president and Speaker of the House. Like the lines are so blurred that it feels like our Constitution is under constant attack. And I think the American people, whether they identify as Republicans or Democrats or independents or, no party identification, they deserve a constitution that is upheld and separate branches of government that are co-equal.
I was just thinking about this as we're kind of waiting to see what the Supreme Court says about the tariffs and how a lot of folks are thinking about this as what the president has done with his tariffs is essentially kind of taking away the House's role with the power of the purse, the Article 1 stuff. You do the money, they sign the bills or the laws and things like that. And when it comes to that blur, well, I mean, how concerned are you about the precedent that this is setting as we move just through the end of this first year of his term here?
Yeah, I'm very concerned. And I mean my neighbors are too. We get so many letters and calls from folks who um decry what is happening as authoritarianism, who feel like anxious about the future of our democracy. What kind of country will there be for their children? And I think the American people said loud and clear last Tuesday that they want a different kind of leadership in elections all across the country. And and we will see if that is still the feeling next fall, a year from now. And, if Democrats have the gavels in 2027, at least in the House, we will be able to be a much more meaningful check and balance on this administration. And yeah, I look forward to committee hearings in which we don't say that we are here to carry out the wishes of the president, but we show that we are here to act in the best interest of the American people.
The shutdown has just ended after a record-setting 44 days. Of the 10 districts here in the state, three voted yes, two from the Republican side and one from the Democratic side, your counterpart down in the Lewis County area, Congresswoman Glusenkamp-Perez. What can you share with the voters here in the sixth as we wrap things up on your no vote and what that means to you for them?
Yeah. I was very clear and aligned with the messages that I got from so many of my neighbors that my job was to fight to maintain healthcare access, to cancel the terrible cuts that the Republicans had made in HR 1 that decimate our Medicaid program, that preserve the Affordable Care Act tax credits that American people, including so many in the 6th congressional district, rely on to afford their health care. Republicans made the billionaire tax credits permanent in July when they called us back from recess, but this seemed to be a bridge too far for them. And to make life more affordable. And nothing in this bill, in this budget deal, did that. In fact, we didn't talk about this, but one of the things that was included in the Senate language that was sent over was guaranteed $8 million in payouts to 8 Republican senators who were subpoenaed over their involvement in the January 6th insurrection. And
I saw that, and I saw Senator Graham quickly said, "I'm cashing in on that one. I'm going to see how
yeah,
that works."
yes, this is, and we talked about it in rules, like, could we amend it out? The Republicans were equally, furious by this inclusion, maybe because it didn't include House numbers, I don't know. But they refused to amend it out and send it back, I don't know, thinking that maybe the senators wouldn't vote, in which case is it a bribe? I don't know. But like that kind of self-dealing is not what my constituents sent me to Washington, D.C. to support. So for that, for its inability to save healthcare, I had to vote no. And I'm grateful that our federal workers are going to be paid. I'm grateful that my staff who's been working without pay will be paid. I'm grateful that the government will be reopened and folks will be able to depend on other services. But the fight for our healthcare is not over, and I'm proud to continue alongside so many advocates across the country.
The website is randall.house.gov. I'll put that in the link so you can connect with Congresswoman Randall directly on any issues that you may have here in the 6th District. I appreciate some time today. It was really nice talking with you, and I look forward to doing it more here to keep
Yeah, thanks
voters
so much, Jeff.
updated in the 6th. And now I guess you got to get back to work now, huh?
Yes, back to meetings, and I have a few other interviews today. But so glad to spend some time with you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good one.
You too.